Jason Haas. I'm a grad student at the MIT Media Lab and run a lot of design games.
Hi, I'm Peter Stidwill. I'm executive producer at the Learning Games Network at the Cambridge Studio, Massachusetts.
I'm Dave McCool. I'm president of Fuzzy Lane Software.
I'm Scot Osterweil. I'm at both the MIT Education Arcade and Learning Games Network. A lot.
So I'm going to start with a story about objectives and the choice of game genres. And so this was a project. It was a project to develop a game where students would learn about marketing, sort of with an audience of students who might be taking a course in the introduction to marketing. And so I had two eminent marketing instructors working with us at the beginning of the project who were very enthusiastic. One was a real sort of, I know the data, I know how all the systems of marketing work. And the other was very enthusiastic in terms of the potential for games and actually had a lot of ideas about how the games might work. If you know sort of Fuzzy Lane's work, we have a strong background in doing things that are strategy-based, often turn-based. Coming into this project, our sort of team we were working with were very enthusiastic about doing something that would be real time. It's got to be active. Marketing students are they're active, they're action oriented. They're not going to want to do anything that's turn based. Let's do something that's more like a tycoon game. And when you think about, okay, sure, a tycoon game could definitely work. So we went down that road. And so we went down that road, based on the enthusiasm of our SMEs and sort of making an early choice about genre, right? So we weren't going into the design process saying, we're keeping those options open until we really know more about, we've tried some things and see what might work. So we built a prototype, and it did a lot of things quite well. It was beautiful. It was engaging. You had to work on formulating your product and coming up with your positioning and your marketing message and your advertising strategy and who your target market. We had all the things that we wanted to cover in terms of actions that we wanted the students to take in there. And when we got it all together and got all the systems built so we could start playing it, it's like time's passing. I've got to change my formulation. Oh wait, the characters, they're not going to my store to buy my formulation. The product was a drink. They're going over here. Now how do I respond to that? Wait a minute. And what we found was, although we had everything in there, and although there are many good reasons why tycoon games are wonderful, that this was a case where you needed to be thoughtful about the effects of, you were taking action in like 6 different areas, and you were really looking at how the different things related to each other, like how, because that's really what you had to do to succeed, is to get everything lined up, everything working together, which meant you really need to be going back and forth and looking at things. And the speed of real time just made feedback very difficult. I remember at one point, somewhere I have sheets of trying to come up with this feedback interface that was somehow going to solve this problem. And I think in the end, it couldn't be solved. Interestingly, we later got a chance to do a project also in marketing where we got to take advantage of this lesson and say, this was a wrong choice of genre. And so then we actually got to produce design and produce a game about marketing where we learned those lessons and we actually built it as a turn-based game, and that also enabled us to make it more competitive, and just to allow the sort of thoughtful evaluation of what you had done and thinking about what you want to do next. So that's sort of my first story, and I guess I'd say that the one sentence lesson is, don't assume that the genre that you think you're going to build your game in is the genre that you should build your game in. It's easy to think, oh yeah, we're going to make this kind of a game because you've seen something, there's something that seems great. So, did I make 5 minutes?
You did. You're great.
We should come up with some sort of, keep in mind the stories, and maybe we can have like the scariest story.
All right, so I'll go. I've got a story about, Jason and I have collaborated a lot, and we've got a story about Vanish, but I think I'll let him tell Vanish stories that we come back to the English context. So I'm going to tell you about a casual game we did called Farm Blitz. I wanted it to be called Money Bunny, but I didn't get to make that decision. So we were approached by a financial education group. They said, we need a casual game to teach low to moderate income young women who are heads of households how to avoid and manage high-risk debt. So, and it needs to be a short, casual game with like a maximum 20-minute seat time, and that's not optional. And so I had to figure out how to make a game that was casual and appealing to non-gamers that dealt with math and debt. And all I needed was to somehow convince them to get a root canal in the middle of that, and it would be the most appealing game ever. So we got to talking about what this what this demographic group, although this is true of many demographic groups, it's not particularly unique to this group, they're just at higher risk for things like payday loans and predatory credit cards and stuff like that. What the big kind of educational and psychological barriers are to making good decisions about debt. And part of it is that a lot of people were raised thinking you've got to save money, you've always got to have an emergency fund. But if you have a savings account that earns 0.25% interest, and you have a credit card that has like 18.5% interest, there's no sense in saving your emergency fund when you're paying down your credit card. But people will still sit around; they've still got $1,000 or even $2,000 in their emergency fund, while their credit card is spiraling out of control. And I tried to think of a way these people knew what their interest rates were. Scott likes to say we could write down everything they needed to know on a 3x5 card, but they wouldn't actually internalize those lessons. So I tried to think of a way that would kind of make this really easy to grasp and appealing. I think I was thinking of a story I read when I was a very little girl about some parable about a man who requested a grain of rice to be doubled every day from the emperor. By the end of the month, he has all the rice in China or something like that, because he had once you start compounding things, it gets completely out of control. So what we ended up with was a bejeweled mechanic where you had to line up we had a farm. You had to line up little vegetables in rows of 3 or more to harvest them, and you earned money from that. Meanwhile, you could buy more seeds, garden tools, other things to make your farm awesomer. But every time you did that, it cost you a bunny. It was a bunny that got put in your pen. It's like, here's your seeds and here's your requisite bunny. You must take a bunny if you take seeds.
It's free bunny day.
Free bunny day. Here you go. It's like, first one's free. So of course, there's a little pen, and as long as you have as many bunnies as there are slots in the pen, you're fine. But if there are more bunnies in their slots in the pen, they get out and they eat your vegetables and ruin your life. And of course, eventually bunnies do what bunnies do, and they make more bunnies and more bunnies and more bunnies. So if you have more than 1 or 2 bunnies at any given time, it's not long before your farm is a desolate wasteland and it's game over. And then we had this idea that, okay, so now we teach the relative value of savings to debt. We had this idea that you had a tortoise, because tortoises grow really slow, and you had to feed the tortoise periodically. And that eventually evolved into something less silly, which was you had an orchard. And the orchard, you could put money into the orchard, and any money that was in the orchard was safe. The bunnies couldn't eat it. Periodically, there would be things like a tornado comes and destroys your entire farm, but if it did, it wouldn't touch the money in the orchard. And very slowly, over many, many turns, the trees in the orchard would grow until eventually they were huge and they were dripping with diamonds and everything. But you had to wait a really long time to get a diamond tree. But if you needed the money, you could chop down a tree and use it to pay off your bunnies. And eventually, it didn't take long before people who started out cursing out bunnies forever because they're so cute and appealing, very quickly figured out the balance between paying down the bunnies as fast as possible and then socking away everything they could possibly spare into the orchard until they needed it. And people would be very careful about which trees they harvested. This one's been growing for a while, I'm going to let that keep growing, let my investment grow. And it really worked well. We tested this with a group of low-income women who generally there was a statistic, they did better on pre- and post-tests on basic concepts around compound interest. It was integrated into a program where they would basically have people play this game and then get a lecture about financial responsibility. Oh boy. And people who played the game first asked more questions and were more attentive during the lecture. than who didn't play the game. And as this was actually written up in The Economist, and they said the question about financial education games is not are they better than traditional education, but are they better than nothing? Because if there's anything that's going to make people stick their fingers in their ears and run out of the room, it's talking to them about debt. It doesn't matter whether you're low income or not. Nobody likes to think about that. So the fact that this made this very approachable in a very easy to grasp way worked out very well for the audience that we were working with. And we actually were nominated for Games for Change Award and lost to Bert. But it worked out very well. So that was a fun game. That's how Money Buddy came to be and why we ended up going with that particular game mechanic.
So if you had to say one lesson from that,
one lesson: ask yourself why people aren't grappling with whatever it is you want them to learn or understand. It's not enough to say, oh, we just need to find a fun way to teach it. There's a lot of ways to make something fun. And there's a lot of things that are important for people to learn. You need to really ask yourself what is standing in the way of it. And there's nobody out there who thinks debt is good for them. So why aren't they stepping over that line to make the decisions they need to make? And then think about how to break down that kind of psychological barrier and make it
I'm going to tell you a story about Vanished, which is our science ARG that we did 2 years ago. And this is, I'm going to tell you the lesson up front, which is that the right subject matter expert is magical. For us, we were pursuing this collaboration with the Smithsonian. We had this opportunity, we were talking to them about it, we were like, oh, well, we have this interesting data about silverback gorillas, and we want to make like a flash game about extinction and what that sort of might mean for silverback gorillas, and you know, play through levels and stuff, and like, it was like a cool idea. Like, we could get some traction there potentially. But we went down to talk to, but they wanted to get their scientists involved and make this sort of like a putting the museum out there sort of deal. And so we went down and we got to talk to Matt Carano, who is a paleontologist at the Smithsonian. And a wonderful thing about any sort of job like this is that if you can go backstage somewhere and touch dinosaur bones, definitely do that, because that's pretty cool. But we were talking with Matt, and Matt like really gets games. He was like a game fan. But he was also a little bit cranky that day, and in the most wonderful way, because he was like, you know, I just hate the way science is taught, and we also hate the way science is taught. And it was like, oh great, that's fantastic. And he was like, you know what, the worst thing is the scientific method. And we were like, tell me more about this. He was like, well, the thing is, like, yeah, you do all those steps, but you never do them in order. And he went on to tell us all these amazing stories about, you know, nosing through data and stumbling across a question just by browsing a friend's data set, right? Or the conversations that he would have with colleagues in the hallway that would spark something. And that rarely do you go through everything step by step in order. Of course, that's a really useful epistemology, but, you know, do you inspire people to learn something with ordered steps? Not necessarily, right? So the idea for that was, well, so what's the most important then? He was like, it's colleagues. It's always doing things with other people. Working with other people is what science is about. And so we did a gut check on that, and I've been reading about ARGs a lot recently at the same time. And I was like, well, I mean, that's exactly what happened in I Love Bees, and that's exactly what happened in The Beast, is people formed communities to solve puzzles. They wouldn't necessarily always start from one place and move in a straight line. You would do what adults do when they're faced with questions. You'd nose around a little bit, you think, oh, maybe there's something there, oh, maybe there's something over here, why don't you do this, why don't you do that, and we'll figure it out. And as a result of that, you could really start to see, like, that this might be what middle school students, for instance, could really use to inspire them about science, right? Is that it's more like something they would do on their own. That following the steps on a worksheet handed out by a teacher wouldn't necessarily be super exciting. And instead, organizing themselves to do something and pursue a question, solve a puzzle that might be meaningful to them is really important. So, from what followed from there was setting up sufficiently high stakes, and then when you're doing an ARG, it's like decorating a house. I mean, it's like very editorial. You're like, we could put anything in here. Oh God. So you start to like, well, what if we do this here and we do this here? So you order stuff. And it turned out that, time is a really great organizing function for this sort of thing as well. So having it be bounded was really important. Having it be something that was, that had an endpoint, because then you could, I think, sustaining like interest over time can be a real challenge. So having an endpoint was really important. But it also allows you to put in benchmarks, right? And say, if by this point you haven't done X, we need this type of scaffolding. But in order to move the story along, let's have these types of activities in order roughly. And for the most part, that really worked out. But the other great thing about ARGs is that you can bring in people like Matt. So I think ultimately Matt didn't do one of the conferences, right? But we had like Carrie Gruelhide, who's the woman who Bones is based in part on, like talking to kids about what it means to do forensic anthropology, because something Caitlin will tell you about later, or during the Q&A, like doing archaeology on people's bones and like what civilization might have been like based on those sorts of things. But having the right content matter experts who come in, are willing to interact with kids and interact with them like they're adults is amazing. So finding that right subject matter expert in the first place, someone who has good opinions, someone who really knows their field, doesn't want to participate in traditional education, has ideas about how their field should be taught or what their field really is, cannot be overstated.
And you also completely changed your genre.
Yes. Oh yeah, absolutely.
Tying into story number one.
Yeah.
So I'm going to talk about a game that I made a couple of years back and produced at the UK Parliament. I was working for the House of Commons and the House of Lords in London, and the aim of the game, the overall aim of the game was to try and explain, what Parliament does and put it into the context of kids' lives. So it's the first big kind of challenge there is that kids aren't generally interested in politics, although when we were talking to kids and doing focus groups and we have kids coming into Parliament all the time and run sessions with them, it turns out that they are actually extremely interested in kind of issues, but it's just that when it's tied up with political parties and all of the kind of the craziness that they see on TV, I guess some of you have seen it, Prime Minister's Questions Time, is kind of this sparring match between the Prime Minister and the leader of the opposition. And although it's kind of fun, it's very kind of disengaging for a lot of people because it just seems such a boys' club, and it's so kind of petty and argumentative. It's very good drama, and the media loves it. Unfortunately, it puts a lot of people off. And coupled with that, the whole and when we bring kids into Parliament, they are kind of awed by the building itself, which is obviously this crazy old building, and it looks amazing. It's covered in gold. But there's a kind of nice hook there of walking around. But on the other side, again, it just seems like, wow, so these politicians are walking over, and they're kind of like in a palace. It is the Palace of Westminster. How distant is that from my life? And how can they be representing and kind of legislating on my behalf? So we had these we were trying to take advantage of the building and but at the same time really show that real work goes on here. And the thing that we tried to do is to figure out exactly what it is that MPs did and to put kids into their shoes. And it turns out it's quite hard to figure out what MPs do exactly because there's no official job description, and this is backbench MPs, so not ones that are ministers or in charge of committees or anything like that. But it turns out, really, the MPs themselves don't really agree on exactly what it is they should be doing. And, and in the middle of the whole development of this process, there was the MPs' expenses scandal in the UK, where it turned out A lot of them using public, well, not a lot, right? Scrub that from the record. Some were using public money in ways that the public certainly weren't happy with, and the law wasn't happy with in the end, and some of them did get into some big trouble. So that was an interesting backdrop to launch this kind of outreach game. But the thing that we wanted to do is to really get the perspective of all the people who were involved in the political process, and it quickly turned out that what we were trying to do, what we needed to do was to simulate a complex system of people, and it's not just the politicians working on their own. It's the journalists, there's lobbyists. And lobbyists is kind of a dirty word, but actually they serve a function. When you talk to MPs, and we interviewed a lot of different people about what they do, it turns out that they really value lobbyists, and there's all kinds of lobbyists, and we hear about bad ones, but because they just don't have the time to kind of like look at things in detail. So we're trying to get across some of these nuances. And one of the big challenges we had was that everyone that we spoke to, they all kind of, all have ideas about what should be in this game, and a lot of them have not much experience of gaming or games, and so we had some funny ideas like, well, they're not really going to understand it if you do it as a game, but you could do that, but put a video up front. So it was a case of kind of pulling in all of these ideas and working out how to a short list of learning objectives. And I think going back to discussion with Bert, and what he was trying to get across in this is that how many learning objectives is too many, and what's the ideal amount. I mean, I think it depends on the game, but I think we probably all agree that if you were trying to do too much, then the game will just fall apart. So I think that's my kind of take-home message, is to do your research, get all those SMEs involved, and really get into the kind of heart of the content, and try and get all those insightful things, but also just to be clear about what it is you're trying to achieve with the game and not do too much.
So my story is about government as well. It's kind of odd that the six of us two are about government, not the most common STEM-style game genre you normally see. But I think one message out of Peter's story is that SMEs are not game designers. We've learned that across a lot of projects, and they're an essential part of the team, but they're not a game designer. Walk that path, you probably won't end up with your goals. So my story is about the American government, specifically the Introduction to American Government course that's taken by about 3 million students in the U.S. every year, universally disliked. We met with lots of instructors, and they all had the same message, that kids don't want to be in this class, they don't want anything with government. They had a civics class from the PE teacher in high school, that's their exposure to this point. It's a required course in Texas and Georgia, so that's where the majority of the students are, so they can't opt out. So that was our sort of challenge, and so our partners in McGraw-Hill and this were partnering on a line of higher ed games. And designing for learning objectives, that's the goal. Well, there were 13 learning objective areas for the Intro American Government course. And they went across the gamut from constitutionalism, federalism, civil rights, civil liberties. We're not much of a game yet. Elections, okay, that's promising. Legislative process, the president, the Supreme Court. So really meeting with a lot of instructors in the team, what we sort of tried to draw out was, well, what's our role, what's a genre that can really address as many of these as we can possibly address? Because assignable and accessible is sort of, that's the magic metric for curriculum materials in general. And so what we came up with was, well, how about if you're a representative? Remember the House of Representatives? So you get to run for election frequently, so that's good. You're in the legislative process, that's good, we can cover that one. You raise money, you use the media, so those guys cover the interest groups, the media. Your bill goes to the president, so we can kind of work that person in. They can get challenged to the Supreme Court, we can work the judiciary in. So that was sort of what we came up with, was you're a member of the House of Representatives. Good for multiplayer, because there's lots of them. All the instructors said, be president for a day, but there's only one of them, so that was and then the other piece of it was sort of going to that turn-based real-time thing was, well, role-playing games where you're playing a role, which has a tradition in government classes. You think real-time, but the problem was the model of use of these products is that people want to use them, they want to dip in, they want to dip out. It really felt like the async turn-based sort of model, which sort of social games, Facebook games, and Scrabble and all that stuff is really made very popular. It was perfect for this. So it's an async turn-based game, up to 18 players. We didn't want to do more than 35. We thought that would dilute your ability to impact the game too much. And I think they did a pretty good job of kind of covering the waterfront. You run for election. It's basically a resource management game where you're balancing between going to your home district and going to DC. awareness, approval, and influence are your measures in game for success. So you spend, how much of my resources do I spend at home getting elected every 2 years, which is 8 turns in the game, versus how much do I spend in DC introducing bills, co-sponsoring bills, getting them passed, and building my influence. And so it's been pretty successful on that regard. And so then we had those 4 at the beginning, which were our big challenges: that constitutionalism, federalism, civil rights, civil liberties. And what we ended up doing was there's sort of a cast of characters in the game. You run into a lot of AI characters: the president, the Supreme Court justices, the lobbyists, the media, constituents. If you do a town hall meeting, constituents are there and you sort of interact with them. So what we did is we sort of built into those interactions sort of a lot of this other content. So you might have a town hall meeting that gets you some awareness, and someone stands up and goes, "Hey, why don't we put those people in jail who are always criticizing the president? Do you know the First Amendment? If you get that right, you get some points. You get, that was good, go to the next thing. If not, you get dinged." So we sort of built that in as part of sort of that encounter you have with this cast of characters. So, it's been pretty successful. It's out now. It's actually in the game arcade on Friday. So we can talk about that more.
So your single takeaway, your one takeaway lesson?
Like SMEs aren't game designers.
Or you start with a wide group of learning objectives, focused on a few, and then the other ones could find their way back in later once you have a solid core game experience.
It hurts the actual game design.
So, I want to start with a light bulb joke from the advertising industry. But it's sort of applicable to games, so you can substitute. Anyway, how many creative directors does it take to change a light bulb? Why does it have to be a light bulb? And I think that should apply to all game designers. I mean, I think that we should always be saying, I guess what I'm saying, and I'm sure, I think that this is sort of summative of what you've all been saying. I think what we should be doing is always starting by interrogating our objectives, by saying, are these the right objectives? Because usually, almost always, learning objectives come packaged to us as, I want the player to learn this. And in fact, that not only is it almost always impossible, but it's a model of a game as some kind of automatic machine that's going to put something in someone's head, which I find very anti-humanistic. But when you start to, so let me just tell a story to sort of turn that around. We got engaged a number of years ago with through the Hewlett Foundation with doing a game for language learning. So what, of course, is language learning? It's vocabulary and grammar, right? Well, the literature tells us that sucks, that no one likes it. We all know that from experience, that being drilled on grammar and vocabulary is painful and unpleasant. And in fact, that there are people who do well on those kinds of tests actually can't necessarily speak the language for a damn. I mean, if you've ever traveled overseas to a country that speaks the language you learned in high school, you may have had that experience of realizing that you just can't use it. So I tried to sort of interrogate what was really my experience of trying to master language. And this is the question I try to ask with every subject, which is, what was the game in it? Not what's my learning objective, but what's the game in it? And I went back to my own experience with only 3 years of high school French, having to do business in Paris 20 years after high school. So, there's that 20-year gap, and only 3 years of high school French. And I discovered that I had built up this game, which was sort of, how long could I get into a conversation before someone realized I was an American? And it isn't important that particular game, but what I realized what was going on there was an issue of identity. That it mattered to me to try to be somebody who was not bound by my language. And so when we started doing the language game, I thought that's a way to think about language game, giving people an opportunity to take on a new identity, seeing the empowerment of beginning, in whatever stage you're at, beginning to master new things. And that's what games are good at, after all. And so that brought me right back to games. And so we designed a series of games in which your goal is really not to say anything perfectly or do anything perfectly, but to keep incrementally sort of in contact with other players, sort of demonstrate more and more sort of capability at whatever level you were at, and set it in a world in which you might be trying to acquire new. And we haven't, to be honest about where the game is, we haven't yet implemented everything we want to about our narrative. But over time, we hope to work in a narrative about sort of assuming a new identity in a new world. But it's working even without that element. But my point was, to go back to it, is to interrogate the objective, The objective is not to put, and each of these stories started with an objective that I think in the end was the wrong objective. Because it wasn't about putting some set of facts in someone's head, and as Caitlin mentioned, a lot of the things that people come to you with do fit on a 3x5 card. It was about really figuring out where was the truly game-like experience that matters to us as individuals, as people, as we engage with these areas. And that was that's always the challenge. That's always the hard, scary part in any game design. That's the necessary part.
All right, so we made it through one round. We have, it's 12:30, we are completely awesome.
Yeah.
5 minutes, we hit it.
Yeah.
So I think let's continue on with same limit, 5 minutes from, and so I guess I'd like you to introduce yourself and then,
Sure.
and actually let me just, because we sort of prompted ourselves with some questions. I'd like to just sort of share a little bit of what that was, which was kind of thinking about the startup process for working with learning objectives would be one. Detours that the design process is taking you on. You started with thinking you were doing one thing with the objectives and led somewhere else. How working with your, and we've been saying SMEs, throwing out our jargon, subject matter experts, because everybody should know what that means. Everybody in this room probably does. How working with partners and how that works. Those are sort of the kind of three main areas for me.
So I'm David Gagnon, and I'm just on the floor. It seems appropriate and stay low.
Yeah, more like fire hazard check.
Yeah, exactly. I work here at the University of Wisconsin, Madison, and I develop games with faculty here. So I feel like 3 or 4 of the stories, it just seemed conversationally to respond with another story, because I think a couple of things that came out are just really out of my own experience as well. So I'm going to try to combine a story that says 2 things, I think, that we got bookended here. And I think the idea of genre being picked up front is a really tempting thing. And I think learning objectives being picked up front is also a really tempting thing. And it's actually even in the model for how many people in this room are probably trained of how to even think about education, as you start with objectives and then go forward. So the story I have comes with working with a really amazing subject matter expert. Her name is Terry Balzer, and she directs the biology, the set of programs at UW that are under biology. And I was fortunate enough to have a conversation with her. She's an avid gamer. She's a really great professor. And she said, I really want to get people into soil, like really tiny and like in there and be able to like look around. And so from a game design perspective, I was like, oh, this is a good way to start a conversation. It was embodied and it was experimental and it had all the right kind of tone for me. So we did the whiteboard thing and immediately jumped to, it'll be just like a real-time turn-based, or a real-time or turn-based, top-down, Civ 5. We're going to make you a bacteria. We're going to explore these worlds. We're going to meet other things. And we spent about 3 months probably working against the whiteboard to get that to click. And the first sketches came in minutes, and we're like, oh, this is working great. We're totally going to nail this game. And then we started realizing, like, wow, there's not a lot of system here, really. There's not a lot of content here. So the solution we thought was to start throwing more content at it. Well, let's go from the micro, let's scale up to the ecosystem level or the soil level so we kept on banging against that, and it just wasn't, it felt like we were doing more work than the players ever would in the design. So the big shift came over the question, hey, you teach a class in this, what's really, really hard to teach? What like single lecture do you just dread doing because it just doesn't work? And it was an immediate response she had. She's like, the nitrogen cycle. And then the question was, well, where is that taught? She's like, in these 10 different courses, like every textbook around biology or, it's everywhere. And within about an hour, we had the whole nitrogen cycle graphed up on the board. It had all these paths. And we're like, hey, well, what are the actors in this? And long story short, within, I would say, 3 more hour-long meetings, we had a functional board game that was fun to play. We had shifted genre. We had totally redefined the objectives of the thing. And I would say it's probably my favorite game I've ever been a part of, because we were just willing, I guess, to take a radical detour in both genre. I mean, it's not even computer-based, which led to all this great multiplayer interaction. And as soon as we play tested, we're like, this is the right design. But we had to like totally throw out our learning objectives. They were totally wrong. They didn't make sense for anywhere we could get. But I think the one lesson here sometimes is that as soon as you're thinking about games you've already played, specifically big genres, they color everything you see in design. They make you, even the concepts you imagine you can teach or the systems you can teach are being colored by that. And it's hard to break out. So I don't know how, but I think it's important. I think you guys have all kind of gotten that as well.
Okay, sorry. Great.
I can't resist making a comment there as somebody who works with young designers a lot, and there is that, having played a million games is it gives you a lot to draw on, but it is sort of important to say, to learn how to sort of to set those things aside, or to say, let me combine 3 or 4 things. What are ways in which I can get out of the mold of thinking of having this limit what I'm thinking about. It's almost like you want to say, okay, as a way of thinking about this, take the game genre you're thinking about and combine it with something completely different. Like throw a toy in, throw some wrench in there that makes you kind of do what you guys did in a way. So, another story?
Great.
So actually, the first hand up was so go ahead and introduce yourself, please.
My name is Lucas Blair. I'm from educational game designer at Little Bird Games. But a couple years ago, I was a Lucas Blair from Little Bird Games. And make educational video games. I'm a designer. But a couple years ago, I was a PhD student at a game lab at the University of Central Florida. And what would usually happen is the people that ran the place would get clients, and they would come in and they would have oftentimes random subject matter, and they knew that we made games, so that's what they wanted. And so it happened all the time, where we would have a meeting with a new client, and they would present us with some random learning objectives. And one of the times it was, they wanted to teach continuous process improvement, which is essentially a stack of Excel spreadsheets and tools that they use, so these 7 tools. And they said, we want you to make a game out of this. And they set down a stack of Excel documents, and the consensus around the lab was, shit. I didn't know how to make a game out of that kind of thing. And when I say they're Excel documents, I'm not joking. They're things called like Pareto charts and Ishikawa diagrams, and ways for them to crunch numbers and make them make sense to optimize processes in things like factories. So, and I made some notes here of the stuff that we did that actually worked out. So what we decided to do is, I immediately said, I can make a game out of this. But I think I can make them think it's a game. And so what we did is we split it into 2 parts. They wanted to teach or have them go through the experience of when do we use these tools, and the second part was how do we use these tools. So it was two little simple sims where we created a fake factory, and I wanted to make things seem bigger and more important and more fun than what it really was. So the fake factory was making ammunition to prevent an impending alien invasion, and the aliens were coming for the Earth, and you had to optimize the process, or we were all going to die. So it made it seem, a little bit more important than what it was. And so what we did with these 2 simple sims, and like I said, we wanted to have them identify when to use the tools and then how to use them. To go along with that, we come up with like comic book style instructions, and then we had little TVs and radios all around the sim that would be giving updates from the outside world. The aliens are coming closer, and all these we would pan across magazine racks, and it would be up, because that's a really good snapshot of what's going on in the world. We added, that was part of the ambiance, where there'd be windows and you'd see alien spaceships occasionally zip past and stuff like that, to remind the player that even though they're inside of maybe an Excel spreadsheet, they're doing something that's important, and it affects something in the outside world. And then we even themed all the tools, so when you would affect things in a tool and change some numbers, and maybe the machine would change because you're building this weapon called the alien fossilizer. And the SMEs came up with that name. And another important thing that I think we did is we had the SMEs actually contribute to the content. They were Trekkies. And one of them was actually a voiceover guy. So he did all the voiceovers for the aliens and for some of the, and then we drew them into the art, and they were characters in the little sim. And they loved that because it became not the game we were making for them, but our game. So they had a sense of it, and we're more likely to defend it. Anybody can play. And then so at the end of this thing, we actually had made it a small entertainment game, because they said they wanted a game, as part of the thing. So that when you finished all these diagrams and you unlock this thing, you optimize the process in the factory, you unlock the game, and you got to drive the alien fossilizer around and blast these aliens as they came. And it was this rewarding, kind of, culmination. And you can ask anybody in the lab, it was not a game. They were not games. The things that we actually presented to them. And I think if I had one takeaway from that is that a game isn't always the answer, even though if that's what your client wants. But a game isn't the only thing that's fun, and it's not the only thing that's effective. And more than likely, your clients don't know what games are anyway. some of the quotes from the playtesting were, "This is the best game ever." We could have given them Halo. It was Excel. So that was the thing.
I think I'm just going to state for the record that using spreadsheets to shoot down spaceships isn't a game. Someone needs to tell the guys at Yvonne Live.
That sounds like a game.
Not a game.
So.
All right, next. So this is great. So I'm going roughly in the, so I don't, go ahead, also striped shirt.
It's a striped shirt thing. Eric Church, I'm at Breakaway Games and University of Baltimore. So mine actually is the scary story. There's no success here so far. There may be sometime in the future, but we responded to a request proposal for something that was going to teach paramedics and teach high school students STEM. So right there, everybody's going, oops. And the idea was to have people be paramedics, and then when you encountered something that was one of these systems, like that was a physiological system, that then it would be a little simulation of that would allow you, that would give you abilities that are further up. But we wanted them sort of decoupled because we didn't really want to get toe tied into having all of these things always available, because it really, like, if you try and look at the scope of that, it's too big. And we knew that from the start, but then still we made the mistake of going to a bunch of teachers and saying, well, what objectives should we be teaching? And they kept giving us objectives, and they were all anatomy and physiology objectives, which sound really logical for being a paramedic. It matches really well, except that if you look at what those objectives are, they're name these systems, identify how this is connected to this. There was no game in any of them. And that's, I mean, it's kind of the same thing we're all talking about here, is that not every learning objective is a game. That was the short version of that, is sometimes there's just no game there, and if you try and cram game on, all you're doing is making a boring process take even longer. And that's, that was, so it really became this matter of trying to steer the educators and the subject matter experts to, well, let's talk about things that are processes and not just things that are your objectives. So it's not done. I don't know if it ever will be done. It's still kind of scary, for me at least.
So that could, serve that, right, if you're presented with a whole bunch of things to do, there's going to be some that really will do well as a game and others that won't, and it's sort of our responsibility to.
So the way we sort of solved the anatomy problem, we designed a game, and it's really like an incredible machine. You're doing the anatomy of a robot. We weren't intent on teaching you, the lungs and the arteries in the narrow sense. But so you're wiring up the same stuff to get this function, but you're doing it in a robot. So you're really getting at the functional understanding rather than asking people to identify the lungs or the kidney or.
But of course they get to the vocab through
But they learn it anyway. But the point was to let them play with the system. And with a robot, you can play with the system. If you're talking about a living person, you can't.
I was just going to say, along with that too, is what I found most helpful is I ignore learning objectives completely.
Yeah.
And then I go, what are the variables surrounding those objectives? And as soon as you find those variables, then you go, okay, how could you modify it? How could you break it? Okay, you've got lungs, well, what if they had this capacity? What if they had this capacity? So it's almost a design process in itself that you're allowing them to create. How do you break this? How could you succeed? What could you do with it? How could you play with it?
One thing I need to get out there is that learning objectives have verbs, right? They're not just nouns, and I think it's what a lot of us are talking about is trying to figure out what the best verb is that will both climb Bloom's taxonomy and get something to be more playable. So my little story is just that I had a combat mechanic in an RPG where you tried to guess somebody's secret passage. And what I was getting at is, okay, if they ever saw this passage from the Oedipus Rex again, they would know it was from the Oedipus Rex, but what I wanted them to do was analyze it. So it proved much better in the end, and this is basically a tabletop RPG, to make the students basically tell Pericles why he liked Oedipus Rex. And that got at the analysis objective.
I'm Gene Koo, the Executive Director of iCivics. So there's an interesting civics thread here, and we publish, and with, I guess your front door might be produced because we're the SMEs, learning games and other materials for middle school civics courses. And this will be in the theme of the ghost stories, and this will be about dead, undead, and ghost games. The dead game is, and this will be kind of more on the publishing level than necessarily development, although I'll touch a little bit upon that. We had a game concept called Roots of Our Government, trying to kind of figure out how would you compare democracy to other things, and how do they come about. I'm going to skip through exactly all the mechanics and whatnot. Basically, the fundamental thing is that it was broken, it wasn't working. Internally, we just couldn't get it to either be a fun game or get at the learning objectives. And it's been kicking around now internally for maybe 3 years. Recently, a potential funder came along, and they're interested in the American Revolution and showing how the American Revolution has influence on kind of how our government came about. And I thought, well, this would actually be a way to resurrect this game and figure out how to make it work again. And when we really looked at it, we said, one, it just isn't working. Is it really worth trying to resurrect a dead thing? It's really about building a new game altogether. And then two, speaking a little bit at a meta level about learning objectives, nobody needs to teach, and this is just the reality for us from a marketing perspective, nobody needs to teach about the influence of the American Revolution on, it is such a convoluted path in terms of where a teacher would fit that into their curriculum that we didn't see the actual marketability of this thing. So even though the money was there and the kind of the game there was at least a core of a game that I thought could be fixed, we could make it a roguelike. I mean, I can get to that, but it just wouldn't work, so we decided to keep it dead. We have another game that we have that's actually live out there right now. It's supposed to be our first multiplayer / Facebook game about international diplomacy. And in this particular case, the metaphor was too metaphorical, and the game was broken. Like we didn't have enough money to truly play test it all the way through. We might be able to fix the game balance issues, but the disconnect between the actual game and the learning objectives was so great. We just have this like flood of comments that are like, I don't get what this game is about. And when we compare our stats on that game to other games, it's pretty. We have a huge drop off on that one compared to the other games that we have. So it's undead in that we're trying to figure out exactly what to do with this thing. We've actually stopped showing the game on our list of games, but we know that people might still be using it, so we're allowing it to still be there. We don't really want to piss off the original funders too much, so we're letting that one kind of go on. So at the moment, as an undead game, if anybody has any ideas what we can do with that, let us know. And then maybe the success story out of all this is our origin story as iCivics. Is we started out trying to create an MMO where you're going to have this vast, world called Law Land, and you're going to have your law shield and your law sword, and again, crazy metaphors. We had some advice that was very good early on that said, don't do that. And it's actually everything we learned from that process is basically now baked into how we approach learning games. For our approach, which is really teacher-centered, classroom-centered, school-centered, cut the game down to 30 minutes, make it something that's deployable, et cetera, all the things that I think we've discussed a lot here, at least for the institutional market. And we cut it down to just the basic combat mechanic from that MMO to the actual game, which is now called Argument Wars, and it's a game about where you actually argue in front of the Supreme Court, various cases, and it's one of our more popular games, probably like the top 25% of our games. We have about 18 games, depending on whether you count that other game I just described as one of our games or not. But there's still this ghost that floats over us, which is a lot of our funders and a lot of our, kind of everybody who's involved in what we do still are really interested in the fact that, the original idea of having kids just come to our website and play our games is extremely attractive. Just yesterday, my son's pediatrician told us that she only allows her son to play our games, which is kind of cool to hear, but that's not really our market anymore. Yet the pressure is still there, and it still floats above us because it's part of our history, and then we have to constantly say no to the howling of that ghost. So, try to get to that.
So go ahead, and then I know one back as well, but go ahead, I know you've been talking.
So my story is a little related to the idea of changing around your learning objectives, but it's actually maybe even a step back, is changing the idea of the role of your game around the learning objective. This is a scary ghost story because it's about math and it's about formulas. I'm Brendan Trombley. I'm a game designer that works within Quest to Learn. And it's a good place. So my job is to work with the teachers inside of the school to make games for the classroom. It's generally a lot of board and card games. So this was going to be, I actually didn't work on this game. This is sort of an anecdotal from my coworker. She was working with the math teacher to make a Pythagorean theorem game. And it was going to be where you had like a board and each student was on each corner of the board trying to get diagonally across the board, like with a grid. And you didn't have enough resources to traverse the board by going like vertically and horizontally, so you had to make diagonal movements and use the Pythagorean theorem to manage your resources to move. It became super, super apparent that it's not fun to sit around and do the Pythagorean theorem while 3 other students are just kind of like waiting for their turn and probably goofing off while you're not even having fun doing your turn.
I've tried a lot of board games.
But specifically, like plugging in formulas in a game is we've learned that it's just not, you can't do that. So this game, it got totally reframed that you weren't even going to be learning about Pythagorean theorem in this game. It was going to be a like pre-activity to the Pythagorean theorem, and instead you were making estimates and then measuring that, and then seeing how accurate your estimate was whenever you made a diagonal move. And so it's totally repositioned the game to being like early on in the experience and kind of created like almost like a vacuum for the learning. So once the teacher could learn the Pythagorean, teach the Pythagorean theorem, the kids sort of already had this kind of like gap in their mind, like, oh, here's the missing piece that I could have used when I was playing this game. It was even really cool because when the kids were playing it in the classroom, there was a few smarty pants students that were like, oh, we can use the Pythagorean theorem for this, and other kids were like, what's the Pythagorean theorem? It just kind of, the moment was, I think, really improved by kind of moving the game from a teaching/practice game to like a pre-activity.
So sort of using the game to prepare for the specific learning.
Exactly. And then hit on other math things like measuring and estimating, which is already like
It's probably worth mentioning that everyone in this room, if you're doing this stuff, should be reading Dan Schwartz's stuff about preparation for future learning. Because I think, in effect, most good games are that. I mean, I think that they're not the formal part of the learning. They're the thing that does exactly what you described. That creates the interest or the gap that's going to afford. Well, it is learning. That is also learning, but it's also preparation for the formal learning that's going to come later. So.
We got some on the floor too.
Here, I just want to make sure nobody can see the floor. And the pink cardigan.
I'll go ahead and stand up. I'm Barbara Chamberlain with Mexico State University Learning Games Lab. I wanted to call back to some of the great comments and the trends we're hearing about really thinking about what those objectives are, because I think the trend, the overwhelming pressure is when you want someone to learn X, the pressure is to make a game in which they do X. And that's not really the magic, right? The magic is when if you want them to do X, you have a game where they maybe have to do T, U, and V, or maybe if you want them to do X, you make a game where they, on their own, conclude that X is the solution to the problem. That's the magic. But I wanted to tell the story of after you make the game, because we had a game, one of our math snacks games, it's called Gate. And the nice thing about math is it's very obvious, tangible. It seems like it's not anything as esoteric as creating empathy or changing perspective. It's like, do the Pythagorean theorem, that's the goal right there. But even then the pressure is so great. If it's X, it should look like X. If it's X, make a game that looks like X. We were making a game in Gate where we wanted learners for pre-algebra to be able to looking at grouping and chunking numbers, a conceptual challenge. So 99 can be 33 times 3, or 100 minus 1, or 9 tens, 9 ones. And so we had a game where you're building those numbers. To do that, you are entering numbers in the place values, hundreds, tens, ones, tens, hundreds. And what happens is throughout our whole design process, I think we did a good job of resisting that goal of making X, a game look like X. Mm-hmm. The result is everybody thinks our game is really about teaching place values. And so our challenge has been in communicating after the game the power of learning through games is we often have the ability to help people learn other things that aren't quite as blatant, as obvious as what they're learning. And it's a real challenge for us to communicate to teachers, this isn't a place value game, this is a chunking numbers game. We took it to our evaluators who gave us questions about place values. It's not about place values, that's a game mechanic to enter the information. So that was my takeaway, is even when I think we were somewhat successful in getting our objectives in, helping people realize how this game-enabled learning is a different approach, is a real challenge and something that takes people attention as developers.
I just want to shout out in response to that, and Barb and I have been talking a lot recently, and we're doing a panel next week going to change, but part of the solution we hope for that is the playful learning initiative that we're launching here, where hopefully on those game pages you can, as a developer or publisher or teacher, you can describe how it can be used and put some of that kind of nuance across.
Go ahead, back by the door.
Thank you. I'm just going to cut to 3 takeaways because we don't have a lot of time. I've got more stories behind all 3 of these. The first one is I would strongly recommend. Oh, I'm sorry. My name is Lee Sheldon. I was a writer-producer in Hollywood for 20 years. I've been a commercial game designer for 19. And I've been doing educational games for quite a while too. The first one is that if you don't, it's the same thing with story and game. If you don't balance the pedagogy with the game as you develop them together, you'll run into these things where you run into it where I don't think that's possible, or geez, maybe we shouldn't have done zombies, or maybe we should switch to Space Invaders. You have to do them together. And there is a give and take. We iterate and test. Using that give and take is how we manage to do that. Also, just because there's a 30-minute time limit that you're given on a class doesn't mean that that can't be just a section of your game. We have games that have levels in them. We have games that have ongoing stories. And most of the games that I do now have ongoing stories. We have a math game out there called Lost Function. Actually, the commercial game I just finished is called Fantasia Music Evolved, and it is a new way of telling stories with just music and images, or actually it's an old one from the 1940s. And the last one is emotion. Real human emotion is such a powerful force that to go with the easy stuff like aliens and zombies and everything, you're missing the opportunity to touch people. And if you touch people, you can teach them. And I would be very, very careful when you try to abstract, that you don't go too far in that direction, or just find an abstraction which doesn't really fit regularly with the game. Those are my 3. Sorry. I have stories.
The gentleman on the floor. Yeah.
So, I'm Francisco. I'm a game designer at Shell Games in Pittsburgh. We're a traditional game studio. There's about 85 of us at this point, and we've been making games for about 10 years, and lately, past 2 years, we've really delved into the educational realm, right? And we really enjoy it, really like it, but we find there's a lot of education needs to happen between us and the client, right? Like, it's our job to educate them in terms of the game development process, their job to educate us in their objectives and the stuff that they want to achieve. And something we've found that helps a lot is we've stopped referring to these games as educational. We like to use the word transformational. And what that leads us is to think about the transformation process and less about the goals themselves. So the goals, like the gentleman was saying, are usually verbs, and that means that they're usually game mechanics, because mechanics are verbs, right? So you don't want to fall into the trap of pigeonholing your verbs. It's kind of like the scientific method thing, where like you want to go on that route. You're like, all right, first my verbs, then my game. Then there's only one game you can actually make that satisfies that. But what we like to think is, what does the player look like before the experience, and what does the player look like after the experience? And the client is usually really good at identifying that. So that's how you usually get them to identify the most important thing. So if I only want my player to have one transformation, is I want them to be able to solve this type of problem. And now you can solve that equation for, all right, how am I going to get there, right? And I think that also speaks about the game evolving with the learning objectives, because now you have the whole development process to sort of figure out your methodology to achieve your goal. So it's less about learning goals and more about the picture of your player after they've gone through the experience.
there's something you mentioned that's sort of come up here in dealing with subject matter experts and working with clients and everything. And the funny thing is, my favorite thing to tell every client is something that Jesse Schell says in his book, which is that everybody who makes meaningful decisions on a game is a game designer. And that's a really important takeaway for the subject matter experts is you're designing this, even if it's just we're getting your input.
I mean, the Macron was essential. So like how we thought about that. That was crankiness that day. Bought forced coffee, I don't know what it was.
Go ahead. I just wanted to also call back to the decisions we make and the importance of emotionally engaging players. Something we did. We really made an effort to do in Vanish immensely. There's sort of a misconception that ARGs, for instance, are just basically treasure hunts, right? They're treasure hunts with the story. You're a pirate island. Here's your map. Figure it out. Decode it. We made this really conscious effort to engage people emotionally, which is kind of and we were amazed at how little things we put in the game that we didn't expect were going to be big. These young people who played it latched onto, and it evolved into its own storyline, like an AI, a fake AI that we threw into the games purely as a mechanic for getting broken information out to the players. Suddenly became this big exploration of what does it mean to be human? And we ended up writing a whole new storyline where they released their consciousness into the internet. And we never would have been, which may have been a bad idea if we come to think of it. But the point being that, like you say, there are ways to engage people even with themes that are fantastic. And if you have to be very responsive to your audience will throw you things that are utterly unexpected. And I know as somebody who designs, it's very easy to kind of clutch your ideas to your chest and say, no, I'm an artist and I love this idea. And if you don't like it, there's something wrong with you. And we more so than many other forms of expression, games must be responsive to their audience. You can never play it, if a game isn't, you can paint a painting and everybody can say, I hate this painting, well that's too bad because this painting is about my feelings and I don't care what you think. But because you actively participate with the audience, you must be prepared to be responsive to them. And I think that you hit on something there, and it's telling us go back and have that conversation.
So I think that makes a pretty good sort of that thought of interaction, and so I want to thank everybody for contributing as well as coming. I think recording.
Yes, recording. Thank you for recording.
Interesting. We didn't end up so much telling horrible monster ghost stories as ways that we've attacked things and things that work in many different varieties. So I'd like to ask everybody who contributed the story to, I'm going to give you an email address which you should be able to remember. BERT@muzzyLane.com. So please just send me your email address and a name. We're going to take a recording and collect our stories. And this goes through all the procedures. Yeah, put it in the procedures. I think this is valuable stuff. Thanks, everybody. Thanks.
Thanks, Paul.
That's my very minor contribution at the end there.
That's good.
Why did